Welcome back to another episode of the Collaborative IEP Podcast. I'm Ashley Burley, your host, and I am so happy you are here. Friends, we have done a lot of work walking through IDEA, and I have to say that I am really proud of us because, I look at our numbers, our stats, right? Like any good business person would do. And I do that because I want to know what you all want. This is quite a commitment, frankly, and I want to know if you're enjoying it. And you guys have continued to listen to conversations about funding that I have found, frankly, kind of boring and tedious, but very, very important. And now we are really getting into the meat of the IEP. So we muddled our way through funding, and now we're really getting into the exciting stuff. In this next section, we are going to learn about evaluations. We are going to learn about the IEP document itself. We're going to learn about participation at meetings, and we're going to learn so much more meat of the IEP document and special education. So we are going to talk about section 1414, which is entitled Evaluations, Eligibility Determinations, Individualized Education Programs, and Educational Placements. So we've got some really good stuff ahead of us in this episode, and I can't wait to dive in. Before we dive in, I am super excited to tell you that I have a digital course open for enrollment. We have opened our ABC course, Advocacy, Business, and Concepts in Special Education. If you have ever been interested in becoming a special education advocate, now is the time to check out the course. The course has 6 different modules. Each module has 3 lessons that are about 15, 20 minutes long. There is a lesson in each module on advocacy, tips, tricks, suggestions. We're talking teamwork, how to write demand letters, stuff like that. There is a section on business startup as well as business management, something that I learned by literal tried and true practice and reading a lot of books. And so hopefully I can cut out some of that guesswork for you. And then the C lesson is on more nuanced concepts in special education like MDRs. There is a complete list of all of the topics on the website, thecollaborativeiep.com. Pricing's on the website as well. If you are interested in becoming a special education advocate, or if you are working as an advocate and really desire more community around your advocacy, join our community. We have nice discussions over on our app that hosts the course called Circle, and it's a really great space. So we totally welcome you. If you're interested in becoming an advocate and think the learning curve is too tough, I have a lot of people that bundle it with the lab. The lab is my digital course that's kind of nuts and bolts special education 101. Tons of communication and collaboration tips along the way as I walk you through the IEP process. So you can buy the ABC course alone, or you can buy it with the lab. And it is a really phenomenal product that I'm really proud of. So we've already enrolled several people, and I'm going to keep enrollment open until the end of April 2025. Come join us. Couple additional housekeeping notes in case you're curious. Yes, I am recording in a place other than my office. Welcome to my living room. I don't know why I'm in here. I got a new computer, and I got a Mac. I'm a PC girl. Maybe I'm a Mac girl now, but I'm a former PC girl. Anyway, everything's in a different place in my office right now. I'm like, my house smells like spring, wet, muddy dog, and I just wanted to change a pace. So here I am recording from AirPods in my living room with my new computer. We'll see how it goes. Rachel did say that my audio has been a little wacky recently. We're having a really weird internet problem at our house. When you have a home office, that's what you're left with. So I guess when I get back from spring break, I will be figuring out the internet. Also, I very well may change outfits and entire looks during this episode. The Collaborative IEP is a side hustle for me, so to speak. It's a second business. I practice law full time, and I have a really busy day of meetings. And I'm also speaking at a press conference here in Kentucky today when I'm recording this on March 19th. I'm speaking with our Lieutenant Governor about the changes and proposed changes in the Department of Education. And so we'll see how exhausted I am when I get back from that and see if I can continue this recording with slightly similar hair and outfit. Anyway, I just say that because sometimes people are distracted. This is kind of an aside, but it's important because we're talking about education. Because I wanted to be a teacher my whole life, I used to study my teachers. Literally, my mom was my kindergarten teacher. And I remember thinking, I will do this when I teach kindergarten. I will not do that. And all the way through law school, I would watch my teachers and I would watch what was distracting. I would watch what their mannerisms were. I would watch their classroom management style. Literally, I observed so much of their in foreign language, I used to call this little C culture stuff. Not so much how they taught stuff. Of course, I observed that too, because I am a student of pedagogy, but I observed their mannerisms. And it really taught me a lot about how I wanted to present things to my students. Frankly, here at the Collaborative IEP and these podcast episodes, I don't always have time to think about whether or not I'm annoying, but I do know that some of you notice those things. And so I usually, if I'm distracted by it, I usually call it out just because, why be curious? There we go. Okay, now for real, ADHD tangent over. And we are going to talk about section 1414, which again is entitled Evaluations, Eligibility Determinations. How do we find out if we qualify for special education? We're talking about it today. Individualized education programs. Woo-hoo, we're going to talk about the IEP today and educational placement, which of course means we're going to get into LRE and placement. Okay, first things first, we find our place in the law. This law, this section, like every other section and idea, starts with lowercase letters that are encapsulated in parentheses. I don't usually read you those titles, but because now we're getting into stuff that's interesting to you, I'm going to read it to you because it's foreshadowing. Yes, I also am fanning myself because yes, I am also menopausal and particularly hot in the mornings these days. Okay, sorry if the noise is distracting. I'll try not to fan myself as much. So we have 5 little letters. We go from A through E. So while we are really getting into the girth of the law, what's interesting is that this is pretty typical in laws. The bureaucratic red tape stuff is so convoluted and complicated that those laws, like we just did funding, tend to be longer because section A has to jive with section J little I 5, they all have to go together. Once we get into substantive stuff, it usually is a little bit more straightforward, right? Laws are based on reason, and reason is pretty straightforward for the most part. I live with boys. They're pretty straightforward humans. And so stereotypically. So that's good news. We only have 5 sections. I think I counted 10 pages when you print this off in the printable view. So even though we're talking about evaluations, eligibilities, IEPs, and placement, 4 main topics, we're going to do that in only 10 pages, which is shorter than the first couple of sections when we were talking about general stuff and funding, etc. So A through E. We're going to look at them just to foreshadow what's coming ahead, and so we see how they all interact together. A is entitled Evaluations, Parental Consent. So we're going to learn federal law and consent, and re-evaluations. So that's what we're going to learn first. B is called Evaluation Procedures. So we're going to learn how we get evaluated. C is going to talk about additional requirements for evaluations and re-evaluations. This, just to satisfy my own curiosity, at some point I might test my theory, but my best guess is that C was probably added at some point as an amendment, right? Because it's just kind of plugged in there. Why are additional requirements not just in the requirements section? D is called Individualized Education Programs. One thing to note is that is what IEP stands for. A lot of people call them plans, and a lot of people say educational. The proper statutory term is Individualized Education Programs, IEPs. And if that intimidates you, just like language regarding disability, just call them IEPs, and that way you don't have to remember what it stands for. E is called educational placements. And folks, it is 2 lines long. So we're going to get more information about that. And F is alternative means of meeting participation. So we're going to talk about what happens if you can't attend a meeting in person. Okay. So those are our 5 sections. We're going to start, as we always do, start at the very beginning. I won't sing to you, entitled Evaluations, Parental Consent, and Reevaluations. I feel like that was a big lead up before we actually talked about some meat. So sorry about that. Maybe you fast forwarded. Okay, so our first subsection is little a, and it is entitled Evaluations, Parental Consent, and Reevaluations. And we have numbers 1 and 2. In number 1, we're going to talk about initial evaluations. And in number 2, we're going to talk about reevaluations. Okay. So, really clear that we understand that we're talking about the mechanics of how to do an evaluation. And then we're talking about parental consent. And we're talking then, thirdly, about reevaluations, which are similar, but kind of an entirely different thing. So, here's what we know about initial evaluations in subsection 1A. So, generally speaking, the state education agency or another state agency or the local education agency, right? So, we're basically talking about schools, but states can do the evaluation, and there are particular times when states do it. We learn that through funding. There are some schools that are run directly from the state, and so that's a little bit of a nuance. But somebody that works for the state has to do a full and individual, 2 components, full and individual initial evaluation before special education and related services are to be performed. Okay. So a full evaluation and an initial evaluation. So then the question comes up and we say, well, how do we know if we need to do an evaluation? Do we evaluate every child, et cetera? Remember when we talked about child find? States are required to evaluate children that they suspect have a disability. And so what this says, it references subparagraph D, which talks about parental consent, but it says either the parent of the child or a school person, whether that's from the state or from the local level, has to initiate the request for the initial evaluation if they suspect that, I'm going to add the parenthetically, if they suspect that the child might have a disability. Okay. So somebody from the state or somebody locally has to do the evaluation. All right. So then we get to subsection C, which is called procedures. So, it's kind of like, all right, well, how do we do that initial evaluation? And so here's what we get. We get some guidelines on what the procedures look like. So it says that the evaluation has to have procedures that meet basically 2 main subparts. So number 1 is the procedures have to be intended to determine whether the child has a disability under our definition of disability. And that has to be done within 60 days of getting the parent consent. So later on, we're going to learn that parents have to consent to evaluations. And so once the parents consent to the evaluation, the child has to be evaluated within 60 days of that consent. Now, it does say states can establish a timeline. Remember, state law cannot trump federal law. So if a state establishes a timeline, it has to be faster than those 60 days. All right. Federal law says you've got to evaluate within 60 days, but state law might be faster. And then the second component is the purpose of the evaluation needs to be to determine what the child needs, what their educational needs are. And I use this a lot when I'm asking for IEEs. So I'll say, well, it didn't go deep enough. It didn't go broad enough. We didn't get enough testing. We didn't triangulate the data. How do we know what this child needs? In addition to that, a tip that I picked up at COPA a few years ago is a lot of times schools will do evaluations and the evaluation won't go into the suggestions for accommodations and modifications and that kind of thing, because the school people say, well, we don't want to predetermine what the child needs. We want the IEP team to determine that, right? And there's a lot of reasons why schools do that. But I'll go in and I'll say, well, that doesn't determine the educational needs of the child because you aren't saying, what kind of instruction the child needs, or you aren't saying what kind of accommodations and modifications the child needs. And therefore, we are entitled to an IEE to determine what the educational needs are. Okay. Of course, we get an exception. And let's see, we're in 1414A, B, 2, which is a little I, little I. And what it says is it's basically, I'm not going to go into the details, but it's basically an exception for if a child is switching from school district to school district, who has to do it and what's the timeline. Okay. So if you need that, then you can look into that very specifically. All right. So then we're going to move on to subparagraph D. We're still within A, our first subpart here of 5. And we're going to talk about consent. So, generally speaking, parents have to consent to the initial evaluation and parents have to consent to special education services. Before a school does the initial consent, parents must consent. So, whoever's proposing that the child be evaluated has to obtain informed consent. That is written consent where they know what they're saying yes to. All right. That's what informed consent is, generally speaking, in the law. There's a much more detailed explanation, but generally speaking, they have to know what they're saying yes to, and it has to be in writing for it to be informed consent. Um, it also says that if a parent consents to the evaluation, that cannot be construed as consent to placement for special education services and related services, right? So just because we're consenting to the evaluation does not mean that we're consenting to special education itself, okay? And then to hammer that out a little bit further, we get another little section here that talks about consent for services. So anybody that is responsible for providing the FAPE, so the state people, the local people, the school people, have to get informed consent before they start special education and related services for the child. Consent for services, consent for testing. Okay. What if there is no consent? That's our next section. It's called absence of consent. And so we talk about absence of consent for the evaluation and absence of consent for services. So here's what we know. If the parent doesn't give consent for an evaluation, for that initial evaluation, then the school district can go ahead and evaluate the child, except for very few exceptions. Okay. So they can go ahead and do the evaluation. And that happens a lot because they've got to they're obligated to follow child find, right? So they might say, well, we made reasonable efforts to find the parents and we couldn't, or to get the parents' consent and we couldn't, so we're going to go ahead and start the evaluation. I actually have people oftentimes, that want to decline testing in a certain area. They want to, say that the child is not going to do cognitive testing, or they don't want the child to be tested. They don't want a certain test to be done because of a child's like traumatic background or something like that. Most of the time, these are really valid points that people raise. And so they'll say, well, I'm just not going to respond. And I'm like, well, I don't know that that's the best answer because districts can go ahead and test without your consent. And I don't know that we necessarily want to test the district on when they would go ahead and start the evaluation without you, right? So I think it's better to have the conversation about what tests will be done and to get agreement there rather than just kind of like let what will be. Que sera, sera. And then what happens if there is no consent for services? Well, if the parents don't consent to services, the district does not have to do services. In fact, should not implement services. And then we go on to say in the next little part of this section that if that occurs, then the school is not to be found responsible for violating child find, right? So like if the parents decline services, then the schools are off the hook for providing a FAPE. Okay. Then we get one little last paragraph within this subsection about wards of the state. So schools still have an obligation to find biological parents for students that are in custody of the state. A lot of times we're talking about 18-year-olds who don't have a guardian, and so they become wards of the state, or students that are in foster care, or, in some other way, they are wards of the state. So schools still have an obligation to find bio parents and allow them the opportunity to consent to evaluations and services. However, if they can't, then they can go ahead and move forward. Um, Now, if a student has an educational delegate, so to speak, someone who has the rights to make educational decisions for the child, then that person has to be at the meeting. And a lot of times we'll see that by way of, a surrogate parent. A lot of states have surrogate parents that need to attend IEP meetings, or, someone that has permanent custody of the child or something like that. Okay. And then finally, in subsection A, we get a few lines. The title of this subsection is called Rule of Construction. And what it says is that the screening of the student by a teacher or by a specialist, the OT or the school psychologist or whoever else is doing the testing, has to. Then we get one little carve out relative to this subparagraph is called rules of construction. And basically we get a little subparagraph that says if somebody screens a child to see whether or not a curriculum would work with the child, that's not considered an evaluation. So schools, have probably said, oh yeah, we did, an Orton Gillingham screener, or we did this curriculum assessment when we started Houghton Mifflin, I don't know, like Wonders or whatever. I don't know if they wrote Wonders. That's an ELA curriculum. But we did this screener. That's not an evaluation. So we know what an evaluation is. We know what an evaluation has to do. And this little subparagraph says those curriculum screeners are not evaluations. And now we have arrived at our second section of this portion of Part B. Again, we're in 1414, and now we are at B. And B is entitled Evaluation Procedures. So now we learn how the evaluation has to be done. Don't forget that in C, we are also going to learn additional requirements for evaluations and reevaluations. Okay. But in B, the first thing that we learn is notice, and it just simply references other places in the law that tell us what the notice has to look like. All right. But we get a lot of good information in subpart 2 of this section. And subpart 2 says in conducting the evaluation, the school has to do several things. And we get an A, B, and C. We'll start with A, and A has two parts underneath it. So in conducting an evaluation, a school has to A, use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather relevant, functional, developmental, and academic information. And that has to include two additional things. Okay. So we're going to go through that again. The evaluation has to use a variety of tools and strategies. So sometimes I use this strategies thing when they say, oh, well, we can only run this particular test, or the only way to determine a child's aptitude is by looking at an IQ test, And I'm like, well, actually, you're allowed to use strategies to look at functional development, developmental, and academic information. So what other strategies are available besides these standardized tests? Okay. And what we're looking to determine, again, we get two more things is number one, whether the child has a disability. So to determine eligibility, do we meet that definition of disability that we saw in the definitions part of IDEA? And number two, what should go into the IEP? So the way that the law reads is the content of the child's individualized education program, including information related to enabling the child to be involved in and progress in the general education curriculum, or for preschool kids to participate in those appropriate activities. So we get this big thing that says, guess what? We not only have to look at special education needs and related services needs, but we also have to see what we need in order to be able to access the general education community. Okay. So that's just first requirement in this subsection. They have to provide evaluations that do that. The second requirement, B, is that they don't use just one measure. So What it reads as not use any single measure or assessment is the sole criterion for determining whether a child has a disability or determining what is appropriate for the IEP for that child. And then the third thing is that they have to use technically, the quote is technically sound instruments that may assess the relative contribution of cognitive and behavioral factors in addition to physical and developmental factors. Then we move on to the third requirement in this section, and it's simply titled Additional Requirements. And this one is very, very helpful. I use this provision a lot in my practice at eligibility and reevaluation time. So it says that assessments and other evaluation materials have to meet a few criteria, and we've got 5 criteria. So the first thing is that the assessment and other materials have to be selected and administered in a way to not be discriminatory on a racial or cultural bias. And there's all kinds of research that indicates how assessments can be culturally and racially biased and discriminatory and inappropriate. And so that's number one. And that's like kind of an easy win if you have like pure blatant racial and cultural bias, but sometimes it's a little more complicated. And so I kind of use the spirit of this in arguments, and I'll talk to you about it in a second. Another thing is that the assessments and other evaluation materials have to be administered in the language that helps us get the most information. So it says in the language and form that is most likely to yield accurate information on what the child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally, unless it's not feasible to do that. And so you can tell that this takes a little bit of creativity. And this is when this becomes important because, a lot of times schools want to do tests that really aren't going to show anything, right? Like, cognitive tests are not super good indicators of aptitude of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, for example. And so a lot of times what I do is I rely on this section and say, listen, sure, if you want to run a cognitive test, great. But we all have to acknowledge that that's probably not going to tell us much except for relative strengths and weaknesses if we're lucky. However, on the flip side, and therefore, we don't have necessarily racial or cultural bias, but we do have bias against people that have executive functioning difficulties or difficulties in other areas such as receptive language, expressive language, pragmatic language, executive functioning, spatial awareness, things like that. So oftentimes the way that the tests are standardized themselves is discriminatory. I'll give you an example. I've done this on other podcast episodes, but I want to tie it into this law here because I think this is a key. And I'm going to try to start doing this more in these episodes. So like somebody explained this to me, and I don't know what cognitive test it is. I used to say it was the WISC, and somebody said it's not actually the WISC. So I don't know what it is. But anyway, there's like maybe a barn scene, okay? And there's like a hay bale and a door and a few trees and whatever. And it's like a physical 3-dimensional thing. And so if they're trying to test spatial awareness, they might say, grab the light brown horse and put it on the hay bale that is to the right of the door. Well, Jack Barlow, for example, he could do that totally fine. He could figure out which one was the light colored horse. He could find the door. He could put something to the right of the door, and he could know where to put that in relation to the hay bale. But what would get in Jack's way is, first of all, like his, I think I said this in an earlier episode within this series. What Jack used to do on assessments was he used to pick up the thing that was more interesting to him. So if we had just read Charlotte's Web, he might pick up a spider instead of a horse. And unfortunately, the tester on a standardized test cannot say, oh, yes, that's a spider. We just read Charlotte's Web. That's so cool. Now, which one's the horse? Because that takes the standardization away from it. So that's like a behavioral thing, right? But then also the executive function of following that 5-step direction or however many steps that direction is, that would get in his way. And it's possible that the receptive language component of this would get in his way too, where he wouldn't be able to process what was said because of the language that was used or because of something that has to do with like the language center of his brain. Not to mention whether or not he was regulated for learning and, had like a good sensory vibe going on. So, in other words, there's so many other things that would get in his way in order to achieve that goal and show you that he knows visually, like from a visual perception standpoint, where to put that darn horse. So it's not a good, accurate way for us to figure out what his visual perception skills are. And then that goes into his IQ score. And we could do the same thing for verbal comprehension and the other components of an IQ test for each specific one, right? And so, is that cultural bias? Could we call the IDD community a culture? I don't know, but I usually just say, so if we look at this for the spirit of it, this is what we can say. However, we can look at this number two. So we're in, section 14. This is what you got to do. I'm going back to the beginning. We're in part B, section 1414. And then we are in B, I think, right? We're in B3A2. And that's how we would cite that. And it says that the materials have to be provided and administered in a form, language and form, but in this case, what applies is form that is most likely to yield accurate information on what he knows. Well, we know that he knows right and left, and we know that he knows behind and in front of. We know that he knows prepositions, right? Everywhere a mouse can go. And we know that his visual perception is at least up to par, up to there. So academically, if that's an academic skill, he can do that. Developmentally, he has that skill. Functionally, he has that skill. He even has the motor skills to be able to do that. But the test doesn't show that. And so I'll oftentimes say, can we just do some other kind of like interview, survey, profile, checklist, something that you've developed to look at the curriculum for this grade or the curriculum for the grade where we last knew he was in this area and see where he's got deficits, right? Because that's ultimately what we're looking at. We're looking at picking up academic skills, functional skills, curricular skills, behavioral skills, developmental skills, all the things, and then moving on to the next thing. So that has worked for me. It's like an argument that's why I always talk about the framework of the law, right? Because sometimes we have to look at the spirit of the law. And I think that's a really good example. Moving on with the requirements for the educational assessment themselves and the materials with them, they have to be used for the purpose which the assessments and measures are valid and reliable, right? So we can't use, a score. We can't use visual processing scores to tell us what our motor skills are like. So they can't say, oh, well, he could pick up every single horse with excellent fine motor control. No, we actually need a fine motor assessment to look at fine motor. They have to be administered by trained and knowledgeable personnel. Something here that I'll talk about is this episode's going to be forever because now we're getting meaty and we'll probably have to start breaking these into chunks. But something that I'm looking at here is all of my friends across the country do open records requests a lot. And I'm really curious to hear from you all about open records requests and how often you use them and how you use them, frankly, because I don't know how to use them. I have only done open records requests for like very specific things that were very, very obvious. And I want to start using them more because I see how they can be a super powerful tool. And so I think this is someplace though where an open records request is appropriate. So asking for the training materials and the certificates and the information on the people that administer your tests, I think that's super helpful. So if you don't agree with the district's evaluation and you want to stay in there, for whatever reason, like an IEE is being questioned or for whatever reason, the evaluation is not, you're stuck there at eligibility or something, ask for the certificates and information relative to training so that you can tell if the personnel that did it were knowledgeable and trained. And then they have to be administered in accordance with any instruction provided by the producer of the assessments. And so a lot of times I'll go to a school psychologist friend, or I've got one that contracts with me and say, can you pull up the administration, like the booklet for this particular test and tell me if it was done correctly if it was done in accordance with that booklet. So that's all within requirement number one, right? That's about the assessment themselves and the materials. The second requirement is that a child has to be assessed in all areas of suspected disability. This is really interesting. And I had a really interesting case about this one time. So actually, I had a recurrence of several cases about this within the same school district. So if a suspected disability is, for example, a specific learning disability. So, if we suspect that a child has dyslexia, that is a specific learning disability. Now, to be more specific about that, dyslexia is a specific learning disability in reading, right? So, and then some states and schools and professionals prefer to even broaden that further and say that the deficit is within reading computation, reading comprehension, or with decoding, or, whatever, very, very specifically, like word level reading, something like that. So if we are testing a student, and the disability category is SLD, specific learning disability, I guess in the state of Kentucky, where I practice law, districts were like, well, gosh, do we have to test them for SLDs across the board? So how many SLDs are there, right? But we know that there's SLDs in reading, written expression, math computation. We know that central auditory processing disorder, CAPD, is an SLD, and the list goes on and on. So, do we have to test kids for dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and CAPD, and the whole list if we're testing for an SLD? And I would go into these meetings and say, no, because we are testing in the area of suspected disability, which is SLD. We don't have to test for every SLD. We're testing for a specific SLD that's a subcomponent of SLDs. And that's the way I interpreted it. Eventually, Kentucky's Department of Ed sent out the equivalent of a Dear Colleague letter to all the special ed directors and said, if you're testing for dyscalculia, you don't have to test for dysgraphia, and vice versa. Then I had a district say, okay, what about DD? So remember that states can choose to include developmental disability in their list of disabilities. And if you need the background on that, go back to the episode where we talk about the definitions. But DD is basically saying that, kind of the concept behind DD is that some kids just get a late start, whether it's a medical thing or it's an environmental thing or it's a whatever thing. And so they might need early intervention services in order to ameliorate the effects of that developmental disability. And the idea is that those should be ameliorated by a certain age. And I think the federal age is 9, but at least in Kentucky it's 9. Okay. So you can keep DD until you're 9 in Kentucky. And DD in Kentucky has all these different areas. So you can qualify, you only have to meet one of them. So it can be behavior, social emotional, it can be language, it can be academics, which is called something different, but academics basically, etc. Right? And so I had districts that wanted to do cognitive tests on 3-year-olds as they were entering preschool that had diagnosed developmental disabilities like autism, Down syndrome, children with CP with more, complicated developmental backgrounds, right? And they were saying, well, we have to do cognitive tests because we have to test in every area of suspected disability. And I'm like, yes, you do, but you are going to learn nothing about it from a cognitive test. And similar to the SLD thing, you don't have to test for dyscalculia and dysgraphia. You only have to test for the suspected thing. So if we suspect that this child is going to qualify as having a DD because of their language impairment, then that is sufficient. All we have to do is look at their language impairment. We don't have to look at everything. And this was particularly true of kids that needed preschool for social emotional deficits, struggles. And we would go round and round and round on this. Eventually, that kind of quieted down, mainly because I don't really care about cognitive testing. I think that since disability category can't drive placement and can't drive services, that it's kind of risk-free, and that is a much longer discussion to have. But anyway, this is a topic that used to come up a lot for me, and it's a topic that advocates and attorneys talk a lot about at conferences. So I thought I would touch on that when we were here at the second requirement in 3B that the child is assessed in all areas of suspected disability. Let's try to move a little faster. The third requirement here is that the assessment tools and strategies that provide relevant information, the LEAs, the schools have to ensure that assessment tools and strategies that provide relevant information that directly assist persons in determining the educational needs of the children are provided. So, in other words, yeah, if we don't got it, we got to get it. So, if you don't have the assessment tool, we need to get it. I have seen this a lot with transition. There are insufficient transition evaluations in school districts, at least where I have practiced. And I've also seen it with executive functioning recently. I've seen it a lot with interoception feelings. If they don't have an assessment to determine whether or not your child struggles with executive functioning or interoception or something, yeah, transition related skill, they need to get it. And that's what that means. And then D says that if kids transfer from district to district, they've got to coordinate to make sure everything's okay. Because as you probably know, tests have to be administered. They can only be administered at a fidelity standard and to keep them standardized every so often. Okay. And so it's important that we communicate so that we know what's been done and how it's been done and all of that stuff. All right. So that wraps up three of that. We're still within evaluation, additional information. And number four talks about determination of eligibility and educational need. And friends, that is going to wrap up this section of Part B, Section 1414. We are, in fact, going to break this into a couple of different sections. This episode's getting long, and this seems like a natural break because the next section we start with is D, which is the IEP document, and that probably deserves its own episode. So we will pick up there. We are not finished with Section 1414. We have worked through Section 1414 subsections A, B, and C. And we're going to pick up with subsection D, the IEP, soon. Don't forget about the ABC course. If you've ever considered becoming a special education advocate, now's your time to enroll. Enrollment will be open until the middle of April. And we really hope to join you. Feel free to DM me with any questions or comments about the course. And don't forget that conference tickets are still available. I still am selling several of those per week for people that are interested in more training. There is so much information about PDA in there, as well as amazing other sessions. And I really hope that you find it helpful. I will see you next week, same time, same place. Have a great week.